We are delighted to welcome you to this session of the 15th Jaipur Literature Festival, protected by Dettol, Banega Swast India. It is our pleasure to present today Empire of Pain, Patrick Radden Keefe in conversation with Sanjoy K Roy. Intertwining corporate avarice and the intergenerational empire behind the opioid crisis in America, behold a gripping and foreboding session that unravels the infestation seeped into the pharmaceutical industry. Writer and journalist Patrick Radden Keefe's explosive new book and winner of the Baillie Gifford Prize for 2021, Empire of Pain, The Secret History of the Sackler Dynasty, traces the family's aspirations and ruthless methods and their role in the OxyContin epidemic. A disturbing narrative on American morality and ambition, the saga investigates the owners of Purdue Pharma and their complete disregard for human health. Patrick Radden Keefe is a staff writer at The New Yorker and author of the international bestsellers Empire of Pain, which received the Baillie Gifford Prize, and Say Nothing, which received the Orwell Prize and the National Book Critics Circle Award. He is also the creator of the podcast Wind of Change. Sanjoy K Roy, an entrepreneur of the arts, is the managing director of Teamwork Arts, which produces over 33 highly acclaimed performing arts, visual arts, and literary festivals in 40 cities across the world, including the iconic annual Jaipur Literature Festival, international editions of JLF, and the launch during lockdown digital series JLF Brave New World. He is a founding trustee of Salam Balak Trust, providing support services for street and working children in Delhi. Roy is the co-chair of the FICCI Creative Industries Committee. Please feel free to send in your comments by typing them in the comments section. Do follow our social media handles to get notifications on the upcoming sessions. Please tweet using hashtag Jaipur Literature Festival 2022 and tag at jaipurlitfest. Ladies and gentlemen, Empire of Pain, Patrick Radden Keefe in conversation with Sanjoy K Roy.
Thank you so much for this introduction, and we're absolutely delighted to have Patrick Radden Keefe with us today. I wish he was here with us in Jaipur live, but hey, as we know, the best laid plans of mice and men have been put to rest by none other than COVID-19. When I first came across Patrick's book, Empire of Pain on the Sackler Dynasty, and as I was reading it, and at the same time I was reading a book by Catherine Eban, A Bottle Full of Lies, it completely bowled me over and it devastated me in terms of how big pharma and the pharmaceutical industry, in their pursuit of profit, as most companies do, have been so completely complicit with the administration and with so many bad practices. To unravel some of what he's written, I have with us, as I said, Patrick Radden Keefe. Thank you so much for being with us, Patrick. And for those of you who haven't read the book, please go out right now and pick up a copy from your favorite indie bookstore or on Amazon. Patrick, Empire of Pain. I always refer to it every time I come across a big museum recently. I sort of always refer to it and try and see if there's been an endowment by the Sackler dynasty to that museum or to the university, and invariably it's true. But before we get into the astounding wealth that was the Sackler dynasty, tell us about today what's happened. I mean, recently I've read that Purdue Pharmaceuticals, in its filing for bankruptcy, there's been an update on that. Will you just give us an overview of where Purdue Pharmaceuticals is and the deal that was struck before this recent turnaround?
Yeah, I will. I should first of all say thank you to JLF. It's great to be back with you and to be talking with you again, Sanjoy. I too wish we could do so in person, but this will have to do for the moment. And yeah, it's been an interesting few months. I mean, one of the strange things, I think, when you write a nonfiction book about a story that is still unfolding is that just because you stop writing doesn't mean the story halts its evolution, and the story has continued to take some interesting twists. In this case, as you suggested, there was a big ruling by a judge in New York, and we'll sort of begin at the end, but Purdue Pharma, which is this company owned by the Sackler family, had been in a lot of legal trouble over allegations that it had helped precipitate the opioid crisis, this terrible public health crisis that has killed hundreds of thousands of people in the United States. And all of those different lawsuits, thousands and thousands of public and private lawsuits, were essentially going to be resolved in a bankruptcy court when the company declared bankruptcy. And there were some critics of that arrangement who said, well, wait a second, the company declared bankruptcy, but they only did so because the family that owned the company had actually been pulling money out of the company. They took more than $10 billion out of the company over about a decade, and then declared bankruptcy for the company, but not for the family. And what happened just a few months ago in the fall was that the bankruptcy judge signed off on this deal, said it's okay, we're going to resolve this in bankruptcy. None of those lawsuits can continue. And the Sackler family essentially is off the hook, that they would pay $4.3 billion out of their own money, but that they would then not be able to be sued on the basis of any of this. And that decision really made it look as if the Sackler family would kind of ride off into the sunset. And what happened was it was reviewed by a federal judge in New York who said, no, this doesn't make any sense. This bankruptcy judge shouldn't be able to just sort of wish away all of those lawsuits and protect a family that hasn't even declared bankruptcy. You need to look at this again. And so that's where we are, is that it seemed very clear how this story would end, and that it would end, in my telling, certainly with the bad guys getting away with it in the end. And this judge in New York has said, not so fast.
Patrick, across the decades, this has really been in many ways the modus operandi of the Sackler family. Going back all the way, and you record it in the book, they were complicit with the FDA. And when this particular drug was sort of sanctioned or given approval, the person who sanctioned it was then appointed by the Sackler Foundation as a member of their company. So tell us a little bit, going back, how did this sort of become such an incredible complicity between pharma, the FDA, and at risk was all of these millions of people who became addicts to this particular drug?
I'm glad you asked that and that you put it that way, because part of what I was trying to do in the book was tell a story not just about the opioid crisis or the last few decades, but really take a deeper look at the history of the big pharma industry in the United States and the ways in which that industry, I think, has compromised a lot of public institutions, public regulators, and so forth. And what's fascinating about the Sackler family, this very wealthy dynasty that is at the heart of the book, is that the history that I just described is very intermingled with the history of generations of that family. So I start with the original three Sackler brothers, who were these three physicians from Brooklyn. They were the children of immigrants. They came of age against the backdrop of the Great Depression. All three went to medical school. All three became doctors, but also businessmen. And they were there at the birth, really, of what we would call big pharma today. So that's sort of after the Second World War, after the development of penicillin, you suddenly get this explosion of innovation on the part of American drug companies that are creating new drugs every week and branding those drugs in new and innovative ways and advertising them and marketing them to doctors and to consumers. And one of the patterns that I noticed that repeats itself again and again in this story is exactly what you're getting at. It's the kind of, I would think of it as a kind of soft corruption, where it's not necessarily bribery in the sense that I slide a briefcase full of money across the table to you. It's a little softer than that. Sometimes it's not even illegal. And so there's a government regulator who's going to decide whether or not you can sell your drug, and you end up giving that regulator a job at the company after he gives you what you want. That's not illegal in the United States. I think to anybody looking at it, that seems a little bit suspicious. And you can go all the way back. I tell a story in the book about the 1950s when the head of antibiotics at the Food and Drug Administration in Washington, D.C., was also an editor on a couple of journals. And the journals were owned by the Sacklers, basically, by Arthur Sackler. And what would happen is that when reprints of the journals were sold, this editor would get a little bit of money for each reprint. And one of the things that I write about in the book is that Pfizer, one of the biggest drug companies of the day, bought 250,000 reprints of one of these articles, knowing that each one they got, he would get a bit of money. And so this regulator who's at the FDA ends up getting hundreds of thousands of dollars in additional income in the 1950s from the drug industry. And it's done in this kind of clever way where, of course, when you look at it, when you sort of shed light on it, you can see it's very, very dubious and highly improper. And that guy ended up resigning in disgrace when this was revealed. But there's just enough cover, enough camouflage that to the casual eye, the corruption wasn't visible.
So has anything really changed, Patrick, since that time and since the book has come out? Has there been a change of intent at the FDA? Because everything seems so complicit, and the fact that even till the last judgment, where the judge sort of said, okay, there will be no criminal cases against the Sackler family in exchange for 4.3 billion. And as you said, the rough estimate is that they took away $10 billion and they put so many people at risk, and over 400,000 people died from the opioid crisis, not just the Sackler, or just not the one that they made, but overall. But has anything changed, or is it still business as usual?
I think in some ways it's worse because you've seen in recent decades the industry just get bigger and bigger and bigger, and the mechanisms for influence peddling get more sophisticated, more robust, more pervasive. And so, you have an army of lobbyists now who lobby the government. You have all kinds of people who are, government regulators, even government prosecutors, who know that eventually they may want to leave government. They may have a mortgage to pay for their house. They may want to put their kids through college, and they know that the industry is there and might have jobs for them. And again, a lot of this stuff isn't illegal, right? I mean, just the knowledge. You just imagine you and I are meeting, and I'm in industry and you're a regulator. And we just have a casual conversation in which I say, "Oh, so how long have you been in the government? How long have you been doing what? Oh, do you like it? And how long do you think you'll stick? Do you ever think about leaving and going to the private sector?" Oh, it's just a casual conversation that you and I have. I've planted a seed in your head, in your mind. Maybe that guy is thinking that someday he could offer me a job. Maybe I could make a multiple of my current government salary. And what I've seen is that sort of thing playing out in very pernicious ways. And I think it happens, certainly in this country, it happens with lawmakers. I think that all kinds of ostensibly very respectable senators and congress people are bought and paid for by the industry and push through things that are really not in the best interests of citizens and consumers. I don't know that the FDA has learned its lessons. I mean, certainly you referred to the regulator who approved OxyContin and then went to work for Purdue Pharma. I sued the FDA to try and get all the emails of that guy because I thought that would be quite revealing. I wanted to know about his emails, and I got a federal judge in New York to say that the agency had to turn over these emails to me. And the FDA came back, this is just recently, and they said, "Oh, we're sorry, we don't have any of his emails. They've all been lost or destroyed."
Wow, that's really complicit. And one of the things that I was reading is that the pharma lobbying groups spend more money than the gun lobby right now in Washington, and that's
by a multiple. It's something like 7 or 8 times more.
Yeah, it's enormous. But it all started way back as a marketing exercise, right? I mean, you were talking about the 4 brothers. They were doctors, but one of them was a great marketeer. Tell us a little bit about his story and the story of Valium.
Yeah, so the oldest of these 3 brothers was Arthur Sackler. And Arthur is the dominant figure in the first third of my book, the first section of the book. And he was just this incredible figure. I mean, to me, he's like a character from a Saul Bellow novel. He grew up with immigrant parents who didn't have a great grasp of English when he was young. They spoke Yiddish in the house. His father kind of lost everything in the Great Depression, and Arthur was this very ambitious boy who went to a big school in Brooklyn that was quite a good high school, and he was always hustling. He always had jobs, and he kind of tried to do everything, just had lots of ambition and a sense that he was really going to leave his mark on the world. I think he had that sense from an early age. And as early as high school, he got involved in marketing because it was quite a big high school. I think it was about 8,000 students. And so he was the advertising manager on the student newspaper, but you could get, businesses that wanted to advertise, and they knew that there were 8,000 students who would see the student newspaper. It was quite a significant job to be the advertising manager. And so he started doing that. And then when he went to medical school, he worked on the side writing advertising copy for pharmaceutical firms. And eventually, when he became a doctor, he also was very interested in pharmaceutical advertising. And all of this happened at the point when you get this huge explosion in the industry. And so suddenly there are all these pharmaceutical companies, and they're making these drugs, and they need to figure out a way, when they invent a new drug, how do we get this to the attention of doctors and consumers? And that was where Arthur Sackler came in. And so he ended up joining and then buying and taking over a pharmaceutical advertising firm called William Douglas McAdams. And many people, I interviewed these old guys, in their 80s and 90s now, men who worked in the industry back in those days, and they said Arthur Sackler invented the field. He invented the wheel when it came to medical advertising. And he had many great innovations. One of them was that he realized that you want to reach the consumer, but the person you really want to reach is the doctor, because the doctor writes the prescriptions. And so he had a lot of advertisement targeting doctors. He would send out sales representatives to kind of make their pitch to doctors. When I started studying these advertisements, I think a lot of them were quite deceptive, but that was his secret weapon. Was he realized you want to try and persuade doctors, that's the way you'll make a blockbuster drug. And as you suggested, his first huge success was in the tranquilizer business, these were the big drugs of the day, were what the so-called minor tranquilizers. And Valium, the drug Valium, was a drug whose marketing Arthur Sackler designed. He was the one who rolled out Valium in the United States, and it made him very, very rich.
At that point of time, from Valium, morphine was around. It was being used to treat cancer patients. But it was the big bad word. It was addictive. Everybody knew it was a drug. People used to sort of prescribe it very, very, in a very limited way. And yet, when they created their new drug, it was many times worse than morphine, but they put a sexy twist to it, and they were able to get away with it. I mean, how?
Yeah, I mean, this is one of the things that I really, that was an education for me as I researched this book, is how much of when we think about big pharma, we think about R&D, we think about the vaccines, we think about the genuinely extraordinary, miraculous things that this industry can do to save lives and improve public health. And all of that is true. But there's another aspect of this, which is really just about a bunch of marketers sitting in a room and saying, oh, there's this other thing that's been very successful. How could we tweak that? How could we present this? And the degree to which marketing can drive a lot of what goes on. So you're quite right that that the company that Arthur Sackler ends up buying for his brothers, that becomes the sort of Sackler family business, Purdue Pharma, in the 1980s, rolls out a new painkiller called OxyContin, which is a morphine drug. And then in the 1990s, OxyContin, which is another opioid. That means derived from the opium poppy. It's a painkiller. And what they realized when they were rolling out OxyContin was that with morphine, it was used for cancer pain, as you said, but when people hear morphine, they think about addiction, they think about death. The doctors were very careful about when they rolled out morphine. And there are these amazing memos that I found, these emails in which senior marketing executives at Purdue talk about how different drugs have different personalities. So morphine had this quite threatening personality. There was a stigma associated with it. And what they wanted to do was introduce a painkiller that didn't have that stigma and that could be used much more broadly. So not just by people in end-of-life situations or with cancer pain, but by anybody who, you might have back pain or post-surgery pain or chronic pain of different types, a sports injury, what have you. That's a much bigger market. They wanted the bigger market because there's only so many people who have cancer. So as they were talking about this, they said, what if we position this as a kind of a safer, gentler alternative to morphine? The trick was that the drug that they were going to use, OxyContin, is actually much stronger than morphine. And there are these amazing emails in which they talk about this, and they said they realized that doctors didn't realize that the new drug was actually stronger than the old drug. They thought that it was milder and a less severe solution. There are these incredible emails where these executives say, let's make sure we don't do anything to correct those doctors, because if we did, it would shrink our market, and we're looking to grow the market. And for me, I mean, I feel as though I have to tell you, I mean, I feel as though I've become quite cynical over the years, but even for me, I mean, it takes my breath away, the cynicism of these exchanges.
And not just that, I mean, Patrick, what horrified me was that when Purdue and the FDA started getting evidence that this was what was happening because of the drug specifically, and that everything that the drug promised, a 12-hour window, wasn't 12 hours, it was not 9 hours, it was less than that, and people were misusing it. All they did was tweak it, even as the patent was running out, and allowed for a supposedly allowed for a slower release. And that was fine by FDA.
Yeah, I mean, one of the things I've wrestled with, just morally speaking, is I think that some people, when they look at the story of the Sackler family, are tempted to think that it's purely a story of greed, that the family deliberately set out to addict people, and I don't think that's true at all. I think there was real optimism when they rolled out the drug. I think there was naivete. I think there were a bunch of obvious questions they should have asked and didn't. I think it was reckless. And I do think there was some greed mixed in at the beginning. But I could see a kind of a moral argument that, you know, in the book I invoke Pandora's box, right? Or Pandora's jar, the idea that you open the thing, you don't know what will come of it. Your great crime really is the recklessness of opening it when you don't know what's going to come out. It wasn't that they could have predicted necessarily what would happen. But the tricky thing is that within a couple of years of the rollout of the drug, in which they claimed it wasn't going to be addictive, people wouldn't abuse it, there's all these indications, as you said, that people are overdosing, people are dying, kids are dying on the drug. And I think that the thing that I really wrestle with is, how could you, I mean, imagine that you have a product and you send it out into the world, and suddenly people start saying to you, hey, people are dying. They're using this thing that's making you rich that you're putting out there in the world, and they're dying. What do you do? And I could see a reaction in which you say, let's pull it from the shelves. Or a more moderate reaction where you say, it's working for some people, so let's continue to sell it, but let's be really careful here about how we market it or the claims we make. Let's just slow things down a little. And what's so fascinating to me is that the Sacklers just said full speed ahead. And when people raised issues, whether it was journalists or sometimes their own employees, or, you know, there were lawsuits from the outside, they fought. They said, we are going to fight for this drug and fight to expand access and expand the market, even in the face of all these messages that people were dying. And that, I mean, it's a hard thing for me to wrap my mind around, to be honest with you. And you're quite right that the FDA, you know, at every step of the way had been pretty obliging with the Sacklers, to a point where, as you said, they eventually reformulate the drug, though it's almost 15 years after the original was rolled out, to make it harder to abuse. And the detail that I've always loved is that they, when they reformulate the drug, for almost 15 years they've been saying the original formulation is safe, it's safe, it's safe, it's safe, it's safe. And then they reformulate it to be harder to abuse. And they do this just as the patent on the original one is about to run out. And then they go to the FDA and they say, listen, we've got this new version. And in fact, the original version, I know that we've been saying all this time it's safe. It's really not safe. It's actually quite dangerous. And we have the new and improved version, which is safe. So you should, now that the patent's coming off, you should prevent anybody else from producing a generic version of what we've been selling since 1996, because that would compete with our new version. And the FDA obliged them. I mean, it's really, it'll make your head spin.
But is this a systemic problem in the United States and, of course, the rest of the world? Because if a similar thing happened with a car, as you said, if there was a problem, you would recall the car if it was going to cause death and change whether it's the brake or the seat belt or whatever it was that was causing the problems. Similar with the airline industry and most other industries that created stuff, except in one of the most vital industries, which is pharma, which is supposed to be saving lives. Why is there such a degree of complicity, and why is it so widespread even today?
Well, I think there are a couple of answers to that. I mean, I think one part of it is that as you say, pharma is an essential industry. It is so vital, and I mean, one of the awkwardnesses for me about publishing this book, not just during the COVID pandemic, but actually since the advent of vaccines, is that I don't think that that the pharma industry is purely a bad actor. Obviously, they do extraordinary, vital, essential things. I think that makes the argument a little harder sometimes, right? Because even with OxyContin, for instance, there are lots of people who experience chronic pain for whom OxyContin was hugely helpful. And I think that made it easier for the Sacklers to maintain their own delusions, that they were getting letters from people saying, "You've given me my life back. I can pick up my grandchild. I can go to work. I can do things I couldn't do before." And I also think it makes it more difficult for regulators because it's harder to pull a drug from the market if you have lots and lots of people who are relying on that drug. The one other thing I would say is that I do think that there's an aspect of this story that is peculiarly American. Not uniquely American necessarily, but there is a very strong ideological strain in the United States of libertarianism, which essentially suggests that if I produce something and it causes great harm in the world, as long as it's passed through hands other than mine after I put it out into the world, it's not really my responsibility. So we have 300 million guns in this country, and guns are designed to cause bodily harm. Some people will tell you otherwise, but the truth is, most people are not out here target shooting, and so these guns in some ways are designed to inflict harm, and they do inflict harm. But in the United States, it's virtually impossible to hold the gun makers responsible for that because they say, "Oh, well, there's somebody else who was irresponsible in using the gun."
And they chose to buy it. I mean, that's the other big
They chose,
argument.
absolutely.
They chose to buy. They have a fundamental right to buy it.
They have a fundamental right to buy it, and also if they don't use it responsibly, well, that's not the gun maker's fault. That's the fault of the irresponsible person. That's a very deeply ingrained idea in this country, and I think it's an idea that you see in the context of the opioid crisis, in which Purdue Pharma says, we have a product. Initially, they said it's not addictive, you can't abuse it. But eventually, they had to recalibrate their position. And now they say, of course, there's danger of abuse, but it's really more about the abuser than it is about the drug. So if this product can help some people, why would we ever hold it back? It's not our responsibility if people don't use it responsibly. And I think that, to my mind, that's a very self-serving, disingenuous argument to make, but it's an argument that has very deep ideological roots in the United States.
Talking about drugs, Patrick, Mother Teresa once very famously said, when she accepted money from Pablo Escobar, which is primarily drug money, she said, "I've accepted it because this is his way of repentance. And by accepting it, he has done good by helping me save so many thousands of lives." Now, the Sackler Dynasty, the second and the third generations, continued to give very generously, sometimes even when they didn't have the money. They gave to every possible endowment, whether it was an educational university or institution, universities, museums, galleries, and made so much possible. Do you see that as a conflict sitting between what they're doing, which was in one sense evil because it was They knew the consequence of that. They hid it, they covered it up, and they continued to pursue it. But on the other hand, they were taking that money pretty much like Robin Hood and sort of handing it out for the greater good. Or was it all about avarice, hubris, greed, positioning? How do you see it? And you've talked about it a lot in the book, but how do you actually read the situation?
Well, first of all, I should say I had not heard that Mother Teresa Pablo Escobar story. That's great. I wish I had known that when I was writing the book. I might have put it in. The I think it's very complex. I think that I would probably quibble with the idea that their philanthropy is for the greater good. I think their philanthropy, some of it has been in the sciences and towards medicine, a lot of it towards education, but probably the great bulk of it is towards the arts. And I don't mean to suggest that the arts, that it's not worthy and noble to fund the arts. I think it is, but there were always conditions attached. These were gifts with strings attached, and generally it was, we want our name on the gallery, we want our name on the building. And so there was a kind of family branding exercise, right? That you had the Sackler name, as you said at the outset, it's become very ubiquitous now. You see it all over the place. And that was really a decades-long project starting in the 1950s. And I would argue a project in which it wasn't exactly what Mother Teresa was saying about Pablo Escobar, in the sense that I don't think it was a form of penance or kind of expiation. I think it was more a form of distraction, right? It was kind of, look over here, we want to be thought of in one context, but not in another. To me, the really telling detail here is that you see the Sackler name in art museums and university buildings all around the world, but when I first started researching this project in 2016, I went to the website of Purdue Pharma, the company they own that generated all this wealth, and you couldn't find the family name anywhere on the family's website. So they're kind of putting up the name in one context and keeping it studiously absent in another. Having said all that, we're now in a moment where the Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York just recently, just a few weeks ago, took down the Sackler name from these iconic spaces that have been named after the family for decades. Yesterday or the day before, the Serpentine Gallery in London, which was actually called the Sackler Serpentine after the gifts that the family gave, and had the name, the Sackler name, emblazoned right on the front of the building. They have gotten a facelift or a makeover, and the name is gone. I don't know that these institutions would go so far as to make the Mother Teresa argument, which is that the Sacklers are kind of achieving a sort of absolution through these gifts. But I certainly have talked to people who say, listen, a dollar is a dollar.
Wow.
If you give me the money, I can spend it on good things. And the provenance of that money shouldn't be an issue.
So Sackler was seen to be a blue chip brand, and every arts institution, academia, was always looking to get some Sackler money into their institution. The brand unraveled so quickly. What happened?
I think it was a confluence of factors. I mean, it didn't unravel for a long time. It happened, very slowly and then very fast. Basically, the reporting about Purdue Pharma certainly goes back 20 years now, and the Sacklers were very studious about kind of keeping their names out of those stories. And it was really only about 4 or 5 years ago that you started getting more coverage. There were a number of journalists, myself among them, who were really kind of beating that drum. And I think a couple of really significant developments were that Maura Healey, who was the Attorney General of Massachusetts, she became the first state prosecutor to file charges, not just against the company, but against members of the family. So she said, it's not just about Purdue Pharma, it's about the family that owns the company. And then one of the big characters in the last third of my book is Nan Goldin, the celebrated photographer, who, one of the great living photographers whose work was held in many of these museums and institutions. Nan had been addicted to OxyContin herself. And so she launched a campaign to try and shame the art world into taking down the name. And in some ways, I think Nan Goldin may be as far as the name becoming toxic, I think Nan Goldin may have been one of the most instrumental factors in in making the Sackler name mean something quite different than what it meant just 5 or 6 years ago.
As we're running out of time, Patrick, how did you come upon the story? And in the telling of your tale, because you've made it, it's like a whodunit in many ways. And like you said, it's a whodunit which continues to evolve because the story is not over. How did you come upon the story, and how did you put it together in this particular very interesting, very readable, very accessible way?
Well, I had become interested in the opioid crisis, and when I learned about Purdue Pharma's role, and I learned they were owned by the Sackler family, I did have a moment of sort of saying, Sackler, God, and it's funny because I grew up in Boston, and I worked for a year in Harvard Square after high school before going to college at a theater in Harvard Square, and there's a Sackler Museum in Harvard Square, and then I went off to New York City, and I would go to the Sackler wing at the Metropolitan Museum of Art, and I lived in London, and I would go to the various Sackler galleries and halls at the great museums there. And I lived in Washington, D.C., and I would go to the Sackler Smithsonian on the Mall. And so that was a name I knew in one context. And realizing that they owned this company with this terrible legacy was quite startling to me. And so what I wanted to do was tell a story, not so much an opioid crisis story, but a kind of rich, multi-generational family saga. That was the intention in writing the book, was to write something quite accessible that people who may not have any particular interest in the opioid crisis or big pharma or the sort of business side of this story could nevertheless find approachable as a narrative, because I think these are fascinating characters, and I think that the moral questions about the legacy of this family are interesting ones that any of us could do well to contemplate.
What is interesting is the family themselves have been feuding with each other. The different branches have been feuding with each other. Do you want to just touch upon that before we wrap up?
Yeah, I mean, you have these different kind of feuding wings. I think there's a tendency when people talk about the Sacklers to think of the family as a monolith, but like any of our families, this is not the case. So you have three different branches, and at different times they've clashed. And there was I interviewed somebody who talked about how this is a person who worked at Purdue Pharma, and they would go to the board meetings. And the board, of course, is dominated by the family, but dominated by these two different wings of the family in different generations. And they would fight, and it would get very embarrassing for the employees who were on their best behavior in the board meetings. But as these family members are kind of slinging insults across the table, and somebody said that that attending these board meetings was like going to a particularly nasty Thanksgiving dinner at which a family clashes in full view of everybody. So yeah, to me, those kinds of those sort of wrinkles and the ways in which their family is obviously different from other families, but in some ways obviously like yours or mine or anyone else's family, with all the foibles and rivalries and grudges that you might encounter. All of that to me made it a more compelling story.
It's a fascinating cast of characters, and really film worthy. Is there a film in the offing? Has anybody optioned it? And I'm assuming, Patrick, that you're going to have to do a second sort of updated version of the book, even as the case continues. And
yeah, well,
with that, the last question in terms of, so is there a film? Will you update the book? And the third is, what are we next going to be reading that you are busy writing?
So there is it's funny, I wrote an article initially about the Sacklers, which was optioned back in 2017, and that will be a Netflix series, which is finished shooting already, and it'll be out at some point before the end of the year. It's called Painkiller, and it has the tremendous actor Matthew Broderick playing Richard Sackler. So I was up in Toronto when they were filming. It was fun to watch some of that, and so that'll be out hopefully on screens before the end of the year. And I have done an updated paperback, so the international English paperback edition will be out, I believe, in April, and that's updated really just up to a couple of weeks ago. It's really brings it right up to the present day. And I have a new book coming out in June called Rogues, which is a series of 12 pieces that I published in the New Yorker over the last 15 years about people behaving badly.
Well, we need to have a second conversation about your penchant for looking at people who behave badly. But Patrick Radden Keefe, thank you so much for joining us
That was a
on the
pleasure.
Jaipur Literature Festival with this wonderful, a frightening book, Empire of Pain. As I said, it's something that everybody should be reading. It's a fabulous, fabulous read. It'll also completely frighten you and also ensure that perhaps you will not go out and use your prescription to buy one of these opiate medications, which are still out there for you to buy. Thank you so much, Patrick, and look forward to having you at some festival physically to continue our conversation.
That's great. Thank you.
Thank you, Patrick Radden Keefe and Sanjoy Roy, for an engrossing conversation. Thank you all for watching and being such a great audience. Look forward to seeing you all at the next session.